Welcome to the Happy Mindset, episode 110. Today's episode is called The Power of Words. So today I'm going to talk about the power of words and language and books. I'll even maybe touch a little bit on foreign languages, how this can open up a slightly different world as well, on how you might perceive words and thoughts and all this good stuff. So the way I approach words is that, I guess to begin with, I didn't place a lot of importance on words growing up. I didn't really understand the importance of my self-talk because I didn't know what self-talk was. I didn't know that there was like narratives constantly at play inside my head that were controlling what I couldn't do, all this type of stuff. So on one level, I wasn't even aware of the self-talk. I wasn't aware of how I spoke to other people as well. Like the power, the influence that actually has on other people, how you actually speak to them, that it seems insignificant maybe in the moment, but it does have an effect on people in the long term. And I can just tell that by myself. Certain things have stuck out in my mind over the years, some positive, some negative, and they've had an effect on how I saw myself, how I perceive myself. So as I've seen the importance of this, I've been a bit more careful with the words I use. I'm also careful not to actually filter my language too much either, because that's another trap you can fall into too. When you filter yourself all the time, it can be very robotic and very restrictive. And that, what I've realized in my life, is that that's also a means of like repressing emotion, repressing your real thoughts and things as well. Like that's a process. I guess when it comes to expressing your real thoughts, that's something that I didn't realize was a bit of a process that I'd have to undertake. 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, if I was doing a podcast and I felt like I should get my real thoughts out, a lot of them wouldn't make sense. Not saying that every thought I say today makes sense, but a lot of them wouldn't make sense. They wouldn't be I wouldn't have had a lot of thoughtfulness to it, because that was the process with writing and speaking. It's actually looking at my thoughts, looking at my opinions, sifting out the ones that aren't even my opinions to begin with, that I mightn't actually even believe, and then going through as well the thoughts that may have originated from me, but they came from a misunderstanding, or they came from like a time when I was viewing myself in a very negative way. So, but again, it's not just me who would have originated that. It would have been a whole bunch of influences, both positive and negative. That can be for you if you're somebody who believes that you're a great sports person or you're great academically, then that belief is healthy. Like that belief will help you to notice the feedback in your environment that will reinforce that. Once you don't start identifying with that being your only sense of self-worth and self-esteem, that's when you can start running into troubles as well. But just take it back to the words and the language again. There's something that I mentioned that comes up quite a bit in this podcast about experiential learning and taking action on things, because that's where you see the real transformation in your life. It's not really just from passively taking in information, reading books. I would argue that, I'm of the school of thought that there's a balancing act to be struck here. The action you can't replace, because that's where the real world feedback actually comes in, and that's where you start to understand context in your life. How does this contextually apply to my life? That's how you get that through action and from interacting with the real world. Books, then, the way I approach them is that they give me some sort of scaffolding. They give me words to start articulating a certain trail of thought, something I'm curious about. For example, happiness is something I've been curious about for quite a while now, and I've always felt that there was conflicts in my mind around what happiness was, and so I never really contemplated it in any meaningful sense, because I was kind of too wrapped up in the surface level understanding of happiness being a pleasure seeking thing. That's happiness. But it was from reading books. I'm reading Happy at the moment by Darren Brown. I've read other books over the years that mightn't have the title happiness, but they might have been philosophy or psychology, but they helped me to get to more of an understanding of what's happiness for me, what's fulfillment, what's a good life. They're all the things that I couldn't just make this stuff up myself, as in I wouldn't be able to I wouldn't be able to just formulate my words in such a way where I'll get to an understanding of what this means for me. It's a combination of real world feedback. And when you're on the cusp of something new, like when you're approaching a new concept or a new topic or even a new field, like even a technical skill like computer programming, as a self-directed learner, it's not like you're just making stuff up and you're figuring stuff out completely by yourself. It's you're going to a new field and you're starting to read about it with the intention of applying this knowledge to your life and helping you to understand things as well on a conceptual level as well, which will clear up things, which will clear up a lot of things as well to give you more clarity of mind and give you more direction and thinking more of a simple step-by-step process. So without the books, without standing on the shoulders of giants pretty much, without using the knowledge that other people have gathered, it's quite limiting in like where you can go from there. I'm listening to a podcast at the moment called Philosophize This. It's all about philosophy. It goes back through all the ages. I started listening from the start. There's over 100 episodes. I was listening to it from pre-Socratic thinking. They're covering for the first few episodes. Even that word itself, there's debate over whether that should be used or not. But I agreed with the logic of the person. I don't know what his name is again, actually. Kevin Smith, maybe? I could be wrong there, though. I agree with his logic. Like, the way I think about it is that in big picture thinking, when you're trying to get a big picture on something, you're better off chunking things down in a way that your brain remembers it. So that term, pre-Socratic thinking, it might seem like it's devaluing the other philosophers around Socrates' time, but it makes it easier to understand that those philosophers before Socrates had thought in a certain way, and Socrates changed things in a fundamental enough way as well. I won't get into that too much, but what I was trying to get at anyway was Thales was one of the philosophers where he didn't have a lot to go on. He had to make up a lot of stuff himself to begin with, or he had to like start formulating stuff. And even the language there was limited as well back then. I think with magnets, they saw magnets as like living beings, or living things anyway, that they thought they had a soul, because like the magnet draws things to it. It looks like it's affecting change. It's affecting some sort of movement there. But an important point he mentioned as well, when it comes to language and words, is that because their language is quite limited, we don't know exactly if they meant that in terms of how we would think of a soul today. Even today as well, people think of souls in different ways, and some people might even use that word because it's such an intangible thing. But soul for them could be something as simple as like it's just got some sort of force to it, some sort of magnetic field to it, which would be our terminology for today. In I guess a more, more secular way. But that's the gift of words then. When I'm reading through books, I'm not consciously saying to myself that I'm trying to make sense of this. I'm just reading it, and then unconsciously things are starting to come together based on what I'm driven by, what I'm curious about, what I'm focusing on, how I'm trying to tie this back to my own life. And that's how that can be great. So with foreign languages then, this is something I haven't considered a lot. I'm going to explore this today on the podcast a little bit. French was the language I learned. I started learning it about 13, started taking seriously about 16 or so. I started taking French seriously. It was something I really wanted to do and really wanted to learn and speak. Looking back, I think French had the effect of helping me question my identity, like who I was. I was 18 years old when I first went to France. Went all by myself as well. I had no fear around that. I was actually like, I see these things as like an adventure. I often enjoy going places by myself because it's a new environment, new people. Even though I'm quite introverted, but if I meet somebody interesting, I've no problem actually having a conversation with them. It's only if I meet people who are just monotonous, or they're just not really thinking for themselves, or they're just not trying to they're not curious about other people. That's when I find difficulties. But I've more difficulties in groups of people where it's just a kind of uninteresting conversation. And I'm not saying that in like a snobbish way or anything. It's just one of those things where it's just a party piece where you're just talking about stuff that I think if most people are honest with themselves, we're not really that interested in a lot of the stuff we talk about. And there is an element to that though, that you like the social constructs, and that's fine. But like if that's the whole substance of the conversation, that's where I find difficulty as an introverted person. Where I meet somebody and they don't have to be off the bat a very interesting person, but once the formalities are out of the way, if they're an interesting person, as in like they've got their own life going on, and I couldn't predict the answers they're going to give me, uh, that's when that for me isn't something I fear. I quite enjoyed that. So that's I guess that again highlights the fact that like introversion, extroversion, it exists on a spectrum. I wouldn't consider myself. I suppose it comes down to the definition of introversion. The way I look at introversion is just the way I source my energy and the way I like being. So when I tried to be more of an extrovert, which in my mind was like interacting with more people and actually fed you. So being around groups of people, that's where you were in your element. I've never had that natural just drive to do that. I haven't been naturally good at that. And even if I try as well, it's hard work. I don't actually feel energized by it because it's the group, a group of people. I just don't, I've never found that like a space that I enjoy. I enjoy more the one-to-one conversations, maybe 2 people, 3 people at most. And that's a bit of a tangent I got into there, but maybe that might clear up a little bit about introversion, extroversion. But French, anyway, coming back to the original point I was trying to make. It was the first time I went abroad to live. A new language, new country, new culture. And it was the first time, I wasn't doing it consciously a lot, to be honest. I think the odd time I'll have a conscious question every now and again. But unconsciously, I was putting myself in a new environment where I was questioning who I was. Because I was speaking a different language. I spoke English quite a lot, actually, to be honest. But I was immersed in a different language. I was speaking French as well. Not great French, though. A bit of pidgin French, but I was speaking some French. Watching a lot of TV, going to lectures and stuff. You immerse yourself that way anyway. So if you're somebody going to a country with not a great level of French, if you're doing Erasmus or something like that, you would probably, if you were like me, you might end up speaking a lot of English with the other Erasmus students. But you're still immersing yourself in, like I was still watching movies and I was still going to lectures each day. So you're still getting immersed into the French language. So I wouldn't worry too much. Don't beat yourself up too much about that. But on an unconscious level, it was helping me to challenge my identity of who I thought I was. I can remember being on a plane, going to Marseille the first time, and I just had this thought I could be anybody I wanted to be here. Nobody knows me here. And it's a different language, different culture. I could be anybody. That was just a thought that kind of came into my head. It wasn't something I actually paid much attention to after that. But that's kind of the unconscious thing I think that was going on. It was like, I just felt like it was a fresh start, just a new adventure. And that's how I feel foreign language. If you're receptive to it, if you're looking to understand the world in a different way, I don't think there's a lot of forcing to it. It's just actually immersing yourself in it, having an open mind, being open to different cultures, being open to different individuals as well, having conversations with them about their different interests and stuff. Yeah, because you don't even need to do it on a language level, to be honest. It's like the more types of people you can interact with, even in your own culture, the more perspectives you're going to have, and the more that's going to change your world as well. Because it changes your thought process when you're receptive to different things like that. And the other thing that French gave to me as well was this lack of emotional charge around certain words and certain ways of being. It was very subtle. Like, it wasn't like I became a different person entirely. There was just a slight kind of shift that things I felt uncomfortable saying in English didn't have that level of discomfort in French. The flip side of that coin, though, it was harder for me to express myself in French because my vocabulary was limited. My understanding of just even slang, even just informal speech, wasn't great. Even when you get to a great level as well in French like that, it's still not exactly like your native language because you just haven't spent a lot of time living in the culture. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a thing to be aware of. But there are the two things with learning a new language, the two kind of doors they open up on a psychological level. The first door is to just playfully, curiously guess it allows you to question, like, who are you? And is there a possibility that I can change in a way that's positive for me here? And on another level, it's the emotional attachment to words that may not be there in the second language. That was my experience. I've also heard an actress, Melanie Laurent. She's a French actress. She was in Inglourious Bastards. She's quite well known in France. She mentioned a similar thing in one of her interviews, that her speaking in English, it felt different. Like, it felt like there was like a freedom there to emotionally express. That's what I picked up anyway from her interview. And that was my experience as well. Looking back on it, I didn't realize it at the time, but that was my experience looking back on it. And I'll just take this into maybe the programming, see where this goes. With programming, then, by looking at that as a language, that opens up another world again, where you start to realize that if I can understand the logic to this, I can understand a new pattern. And then with programming, coding, it's like a digital language. It's like you're speaking to computers. Like, so you're looking at these things as, instead of interacting with a human, you're interacting with a machine. So it's the inputs and outputs. So if I haven't got the language there, I can't speak to the computer. So it's kind of like with French starting off. If I had to do French all over again, or if I had to learn a new language again, I would speak faster. Obviously, that's dependent on whether I'm around French people or not, the native speakers of the language. But in a perfect situation, I would speak faster and get over this idea that it needs to be perfect, because that was something that held me back for a long time in the system, the education system. I had this idea, this false idea in my head, that I'd need to reach a certain arbitrary great level in French before I could speak to French people. But it's through the actual speaking that you get better at it, you get more comfortable with it. And so that's what made programming as a language more accessible to me. Because when I was building some websites, I was learning some basic markup language to begin with, HTML, CSS. When I was learning that, then I didn't expect perfection. I was like, it's higgledy-piggledy and throwing things together. But I still had eyes like for what's the actual structure here, what's the patterns here I need to start picking up on. And it was from doing the thing then that I started to notice the few things that you always need. And that gives you a springboard. Same thing with a language in the real world as well. We start to notice basic patterns that begin any conversation. Even coming back to the start of this podcast when I was talking about, I like meeting interesting people. I don't have much problem having a conversation with an interesting person, whether I know them or not beforehand. It just seems to be something that I can do. Whereas with groups of people, I struggle. But with groups of people, the reason I struggle is because I just don't find it engaging, because I can kind of predict the pattern of what's going on. And a lot of people can do this. It's not just me, to be honest. Like, I think anybody who pays attention would notice this. But that gives you an insight into the patterns of a language. Like, what generally people talk about. What are the safe zones for people to talk about, especially when they're like a new group of people. Nobody knows each other. It'll be like, how are you? What do you do for your job? Why are you here? Where are you from? Those types of questions come up, and they'll be similar. Like even the structure and the answers, you can start to develop on that too. That's slightly a bit more complex, but it's not that complex. It's you can, again, just like with the approach I have for programming, there's no perfection here. It's just play around with it and get a feel for it, and that's how you kind of discover the pattern, the different patterns and different threads of thinking there. I'll just take this into books actually as well with languages. It was from reading and then writing. So reading is a very passive thing. But when you back it up with writing is more of an active thing. Speaking is an active thing. Because it's putting things that you're learning into words, and that's when you start to see whether you know something or not, or whether you need to like elaborate more on something. That's what I generally do. Like, do I have where are my gaps? It's not even do I have gaps in my knowledge, it's where are the gaps in my knowledge. And so then you can build from that then. But writing blog posts for a long period of time, for a number of years, and then writing my book, that all highlighted the power of thoughts and concepts to me. I hadn't really made that connection before. I think it was especially after I wrote my book that I started to realize how powerful it is to get clear on concepts and thoughts that are shaping your life. Because you're getting eyes for that. Up until I started writing, it was kind of like I was living a life where academia, the world of academia, concepts, and all that thinking was separate from actual reality. So I looked at looked at my real life objectively. It looked objective. It looked like I'm walking around in a world of objects, and I'm it's verbs, so I'm doing things, and there's objects. But I didn't see like that much of a connection between the thought process and the real world. Like, how is the thought process affecting how I actually see the world? Because with language and with words and with understanding, you start to realize that, like, if I don't understand something, I won't see it in the world. But when I do understand something, I'll see it in the world. Even something as simple as the Pareto principle, the 80-20 principle. When you start to understand what the implications of that are, then that's how you start to look at a lot of different things then. Like, once that clicked for me that, like, this is actually a thing, that's how I viewed programming, to make it easier for me to tackle the big steep learning curve to begin with. It was sifting through the stuff that's like 20% of the important stuff. I know it's there because I've seen it in languages, and then I've read about it as well, about it being in economics and other areas as well that I haven't studied. And even in, what was it? I think it was originally found in the garden peas. Like Pareto himself, I think Pareto was his name. He noticed that 20% of the peas were producing 80% of the output in his garden. And then he started noticing other macro trends. I think it was in economics. I think he noticed that. I think they noticed in Italy as well, the wealth, 20% of the people owned about 80% or more of the land or something like that. So that's when you start seeing it playing out more. But that's another thing. Like, it's from reading. Reading will inform me. It's a scaffolding. It's from the writing and the speaking then. That's where I start to see the power of thought and the power of thinking, the power of your thought process. And that's all influencing your self-talk as well. I found that the self-talk, well, first of all, the self-talk is becoming aware that the self-talk in your head, there's narratives and stuff in your head. Then when you start to notice that like the things that are, the emotions that are making you feel uneasy and like you can't do things, there's often narratives caught in there. Once you become more aware of the narratives, you can even do that through taking action. When you feel nervous and you feel anxious, just do the thing anyway. Just understand your own, where you're at. Just, I guess, know thyself. You'll know your own tolerance to risk after a while. You feel that out. I've learned that the hard way too. Sometimes I've taken it to too much of an extreme where I freak myself out with anxiety and stuff. But I've learned over the years to incrementally do that. To know that and to know thyself. That's the principle there. But yeah, once you're aware of the self-talk, then it's a process of like gradually shifting that. And that's a long-term process. That doesn't change overnight because it's quite deeply ingrained, self-talk. But then the beauty of it is that, like, when you are more conscious with that, that also becomes quite deeply ingrained. It's just, it's going from like something that was an unconscious thing that you never knew was happening to something that from this point forward is a conscious thing that you're priming your mind with thoughts and ideas and ways of being that will actually help you in your life rather than being detrimental to your life. And that's why I like programming, because that's another analogy that I kind of see and draw from, is that with programming, you're automating stuff. And the way I look at it when I'm unconscious, it's like an automated program that's running there. So a lot of these programs that I didn't consciously put in there, they can wreak havoc. There's bugs in there and everything that they're just not optimized to actually help me in my life. But then the beauty of it is that as I learn to code, I can start finding these programs, understanding these programs, debugging these programs, rewriting these programs. That's the kind of analogy I would draw from learning to code. It's like this with the mind. It's like you start learning some basic stuff like breathing. Just even taking the time each day. I do through meditation, just to breathe. Like, that's the main thing I focus on in meditation. It's not the thoughts that are going through my head. It's not suppressing any thoughts. It's actually just breathing, being present as much as possible. with the understanding that it's not going to be 20 minutes or however long I do it, one long breath of like no thought. Not possible. But just simple stuff like that, and then just becoming aware of your habits, be writing, just be more intentional with the things you're reading. Be more intentional with just writing stuff out. If you don't want to blog and write a book or anything, journal. You can write it down, or do a video journal like I did in the podcast before. I explained like how I use video journals sometimes. Just anything where you're just verbalizing the potential chaos that could be going through your head otherwise. Because when I wasn't really conscious with this stuff, there was a lot of thought loops in there that were just going nowhere, and there was a lot of unconsciousness, and that led to a lot of like psychological restriction, a lot of inability to express emotion, a lot of it was just chaos internally, and I wasn't even aware of it. That's it. That's what I wanted to cover today: the power of language. It can be a very powerful thing, and I just wanted to talk about it today. It's made a huge impact in my life in the long term, so I just wanted to share some ideas and thoughts today. So thanks again for listening, and I will speak to you on the next episode.